Hello, today we're going to be talking about human rights advocacy and the ways that women are disposable. One of the first things that we need to examine is to think about what we mean by international law. What is international law? A modern definition of international law refers to law that deals with the conduct of states and of international organizations and with their relations inter se, as well as with some of their relations with persons, whether natural or juridical. In other words, part of what we want to see about international law is that it's not just law between states, between countries, that is. It also applies to people and the relationships between people. Throughout the semester, we're going to be focused on international human rights law. Now, modern human rights law developed after World War II and was essentially responding to the many massive human rights violations that happened during World War II. I'd like to go through a timeline to give you a sense of some of the important moments in United Nations work on human rights and women's rights. This will give you a larger sense of the historical trajectory of women's human rights and how that relates to women's issues today. If we begin in 1945, the United Nations created the UN Charter. Essentially, Article 1 says that international cooperation to promote respect for rights and fundamental freedoms for all as to race, sex, language, or religion. In other words, from the beginning, the UN Charter establishes that individuals have human rights on the basis of race, sex, language, or religion. In 1948, the UN develops the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are 30 articles in the Declaration of Human Rights. While many of the human rights established in the Declaration are applicable to women, it's worth noting the use of masculine pronouns throughout this document. For example, the Declaration repeatedly uses his and himself in the Declaration. One of the questions that feminists have asked is whether we should assume that this also applies to women. So notice that in the very first document that establishes some of women's human rights, it also uses masculine pronoun and it uses exclusive language. If we move ahead to 1975 begins the UN Decade for Women, which is essentially lasts from 1975 to 1985. 1975 is also known as International Women's Year. And in many ways, this marked a resurgence of the transnational women's movement. One of the things that the United Nations chose to focus on was that there was not enough information on the status of women worldwide. So one of the first orders of business was for the UN to collect statistical data and publish reports on the status of women. Today, the UN publishes regular reports on the status of women. In 1975, CEDAW, which is also an acronym for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This is known as one of the key documents on women's human rights. Now, it's worth noting that CEDAW has been ratified by 187 member states, but there are still several countries that have refused to ratify CEDAW. Notably, the United States is one of the few countries that has refused to ratify it. Now, what's interesting about this is that one of the many arguments given by the U.S. is that it would give too much power to international law and take power away from the nation state. Many feminists criticize the U.S. refusal to ratify as a symbolic gesture that they are not formally and seriously committed to women's equality and to ending discrimination against women. Because essentially what CETA does is that it requires states to eliminate gender-based discrimination by passing laws. And one of the ways that states can do that is also to ensure that they do not have laws on the book that would discriminate against women. Every 4 years, nations that have ratified CETA are required to submit reports on their progress to the committee. And this committee is made up of 23 women's rights experts who monitor compliance and issue recommendations on how to end discrimination against women. Now, if CEDA's recommendation that gender violence violates women's human rights is ultimately what drew international attention to women's rights as human rights. In other words, CEDA was one of the first international documents to argue that forms of gender violence violate women's human rights. The 1980s and 90s had a lot of growth and networking around feminist issues. In particular, transnational feminist networks began to play an important role internationally. Sometimes referred to as TFNs, Transnational Feminist Network, combined with feminist resistance to globalization and political forces, helped in many ways to create a new global feminist identity. In fact, in 1993, at the Vienna Conference, a key document, the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, was created, and this ultimately documented the many abuses of women's rights in 5 specific areas. The first area, abuse in the family. 2, war crimes. 3, violations of bodily integrity. 4, socioeconomic abuses. 5, political participation and persecution abuses. Identifying these violations of women's rights represented a major success in bringing the women's human rights agenda onto the general human rights agenda. It also led to definitions of practices that were relevant to women around the world, such as sati, dowry deaths, domestic violence, female genital circumcision, and identified these all as examples of violence against women. Previously, these practices were often just considered cultural customs and traditions, and they were not considered human rights violations. In 1994, the United Nations International Conference on Population and Development, commonly referred to as ICPD, was held in the September of 1994 in Cairo, Egypt. The ICPD Program of Action, which is sometimes referred to as the Cairo Consensus, was adopted by 179 representatives of government. The conference ultimately reaffirmed the interrelationship between population, sustained economic growth, and sustainable development. More importantly, from a women's health perspective, the conference emphasized the importance of gender equality, equity, and empowerment of women. It recognized women's reproductive health and rights, as well as empowerment and gender equality, as cornerstones of population and development programs. The reproductive rights and reproductive health, particularly of women, were framed in the context of individuals rather than the time-honored tradition of viewing them as targets of population control at national levels. So it's quite important that the ICPD identified the ways that population control often targeted women and used coercive practices. Instead, ICPD advocated for the understanding that sustainable development, women's health, and reproductive health are very linked. They asked that women be able to ensure their rights, realize their full potential, and become equal partners in development programs. In 1995, the Beijing Conference occurred, and there have been many follow-up sessions held by the Committee on the Status of Women in 5-year intervals, the purpose of which is to review progress and to promote transnational feminist networks. The Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing was held in September of 1995 in the People's Republic of China. This particular conference played a vital role in refocusing the world's attention on the plight of women and the yet unfinished agenda of equality and empowerment. The Beijing Conference has been hailed as a landmark in policy terms, setting a global policy framework to advance gender equality. Ultimately, the conference ended with the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action that was then forwarded to the General Assembly of the United Nations at its 50th session. The declaration unequivocally stated that women's rights are human rights, and this slogan became increasingly popular during the conference and after as well. This was also an important moment because it was one of the first UN conferences to really incorporate the media and to publicize the low status and power of women around the world. The platform of action created in Beijing was one of the most comprehensive agendas ever negotiated for women's empowerment. It was negotiated by 5,000 delegates from 189 countries, in which they identified 12 critical areas of concern, one of which was violence against women. In their declaration, they included agreeing to eradicate harmful customary or traditional practices, and they stated that women have the right to decide freely and responsibly on matters related to their sexuality without coercion, discrimination, and violence. Yet at the conference, many issues arose and certain problems became clear in terms of transnational feminist advocacy. Oftentimes, nationalist concerns were accused of trying to take over the agenda. 2, language issues were of concern. There was some critique over the reliance of English as a primary language being spoken at the conference. There were critiques that consensus-based decision-making needed to happen so that women from all countries around the world could have their agendas met. In regard to language issues, documents and translations were difficult for many reasons. Each national government wanted to make sure their view was represented, but oftentimes there was controversy over the word gender itself. The word gender does not exist in all languages, nor is there a form of gender-neutral language in every language around the world, so this created some barriers. Some countries also objected to the phrase universal human rights and argued that human rights are relative to culture. We'll take a look at this perspective when we look at female circumcision. One of the ways that they attempted to solve this was to drop the word universal. In 1999, the United Nations convened a special session called ICPD Plus 5, where they wanted to take stock of the progress made towards meeting some of the goals established at ICPD. And they identified several areas such as reproductive health care, contraception, female education and literacy, maternal mortality reduction, and HIV and AIDS to be major issues with inadequate progress, and they called for urgent action. They also reaffirmed some of the goals of the original conference and set benchmarks of progress towards reaching them. In 2000, the UN Security Council passed a Resolution 1325, which required that women were included in peace negotiations and peacekeeping missions. So one of the commitments that we see being established is that women need to take part in the decision-making processes and have a seat at the table. From 2000 to 2005, transnational feminist activists worked to adopt a gender perspective to be included in the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. One of the MDGs was gender equality, and they questioned how the accomplishment of MDGs could help further women's status. The Millennium Declaration set a target date of 2015 for achieving most of the Millennium Development Goals. The current status of women's health, for example, as revealed by the reports, offers a mixed picture. In other words, while several of the goals and their related targets have shown remarkable progress, there are several regions and nations that are struggling to progress on one or more of the Millennium Development Goals. In other words, there's mixed results. And almost 30 years after the Alma Ata Declaration, which affirmed health for all by the year 2000, we need closer scrutiny of policies and programs that are currently in place. We need to ask questions about the willingness of nations and their citizens to empower women and accord them equality. I encourage you to recognize that women's rights are also a development issue with far-reaching consequences. When women make progress, the whole nation benefits, and the mark of true progress is when women are able to exercise their fundamental rights in the areas of health, education, and employment. The accomplishment of MDGs will help to improve the overall status of women in the arenas of political, social, and economic development, since the world attention will be on women and improving their status. Now, so far I've identified many of the successes of the United Nations in regard to women's rights. However, there have been many failures as well. One of the issues that the UN has struggled with is overdue reports, inaccurate information, and a limited ability to hold nations accountable when they don't meet their goals. Yet still we see the attempt to frame women's rights as human rights and to protect those rights under international law. The goal is to lend legitimacy to these political demands because the practice of protecting human rights is already accepted by most governments, and there are protocols in place to deal with these abuses. When we consider women's rights as human rights, we are able to insist that governments not deny or violate women's rights. Now, women's rights as human rights are quite important, and the United Nations articulates that women's rights have traditionally been viewed as separate from human rights. Yet throughout their lifetime, women are often faced with violations of their human rights, such as violations often taking the form of gender-based violence and discrimination. One of the core principles behind women's human rights is that standards of gender equality cannot be realized except by recognizing the basic socioeconomic rights of women. The lack of access to economic opportunities and basic services prevents women from exercising their human rights. Advocates like Charlotte Bunch have become outspoken feminist advocates on this issue of women's human rights. Hillary Clinton is also someone who's spoken about human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. Now, there are many feminist critiques for understanding or trying to frame women's rights as human rights. One of the first points or first critiques made by feminist theorists is that international law is gendered. If you recall earlier in this presentation, I spoke about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights using masculine language referring to he and him throughout. So one of the critiques is that the way that international law and norms are framed is through a masculine perspective and use masculine language. Another point is Riley's argument, which she makes in Women's Human Rights. She argues that mainstream approaches to human rights versus cosmopolitan feminist engagement reveals to us that men often hold most of the powerful positions in society. In other words, that the people making the laws are often men themselves. And we need to sort of have an important discussion about thinking of mainstream human rights versus a feminist engagement with human rights. Another key example for thinking of critiques of women's rights as human rights would be the global campaign for women's human rights and violence against women. One of the issues is that the Secretary General pressed successfully for the creation of the UN Women, which was a major new agency that consolidated the UN's work in the area. His advocacy for women's rights and gender equality included the Unite to End Violence Against Women campaign, the Stop Rape Now initiative, and the creation of a network of men leaders and the establishment of a new special representative on sexual violence and conflict. Now, this has essentially represented, from most people, important progress. But your authors for this week ask an important question. Are women human yet? In other words, despite much of the progress that the United Nations and nations have been able to make with regard to women's human rights, we also see widespread violations of women's rights. For example, gender violence is increasing. Femicide and other gender-based violence issues such as dowry death, honor killings, war rape, sexual assault and harassment, female genital cutting, and sex trafficking are all examples of violations of human rights. We also see important feminist issues that need to be tackled, such as child brides, forced marriage, bride kidnapping, the feminization of poverty, exploitation of female workers, and wage inequity as key issues that need to be addressed moving forward. The UN Women recently ran a campaign that gained much notoriety called the Autocomplete Truth, where essentially they used Google's autocorrect feature where they type in a phrase such as women need to, and you can see from the image that some of the first things that come up reveal a lot about how we think about women. For example, women need to be put in their place, women need to know their place, women need to be controlled. And they used this media campaign in order to raise awareness about the widespread discrimination against women. As we move forward, we're going to consider one of the key critiques made against international law and women's human rights, in that it asks what question culture plays.